an associate professor at university in a copy.
Also, I have to say, Christian, they really can't be too familiar with me because my guess is they wouldn't actually show up then for this. Yes, my topic is about immigration, courage, fear, and individual rights. So I want to first mention the libertarian principle as the framework for the rest of this presentation. First, libertarians believe in individual rights. They own their life, their liberty, and the product of their life and liberty, their property. And they don't have a right to take forcibly or with fraud from another person. They own it, and they have a right to it. And if I don't have a right to take it by force or fraud from another person, I don't have the right to ask someone else to do it for me. It's the same action, whether I do it by myself, or a large number of people do it, or whether we ask people with fine hats to do this action for us. I believe that the libertarian principle leads us to very, very practical, humanitarian, and ethical consequences, which I'll elaborate on. Now, one thing that becomes rather interesting in our world of movement of goods and services and people around the world, I notice what a different treatment there is for barrels of oil and human beings. Now you notice that countries all over the world are eager to have more and more barrels of oil. I think they'll subsidize people with tax credits and all kinds of benefits to go digging for oil out of the ground. They encourage the trade. The U.S. military even sends ships all over the world to escort the convoys back, and providing all the protection and insurance costs for oil companies to get oil everywhere in the world because we want as much as we can get. Barrels of oil are great. On the other hand, the way we treat humans is, well, they must not be as valuable as barrels of oil because we do everything to keep them out, restrict them with all these phenomenal things that Valerie just commented on. Now, well, perhaps this is a little bit indescript here. Let's suggest a real human being here. Will a real human being fit this here? Stand up. Please stand up. Now, I ask you, is he worth more or less than a barrel of oil?
Less.
Sorry, I should have picked a different human being.
Can he power a car?
Well, I contend that actually he's worth a lot more than a barrel of oil. I mean, he has arms and his legs and brain and eyes, ears, mouth. I mean, he can produce a tremendous amount of wealth. He is a creator, and that barrel of oil isn't. And I'd say that he, as a human being, has rights to his own life, his liberty, and the product of his life and liberty, his property. And the barrel of oil has no rights. Now, you notice that there are a lot of people who move around the world, okay? And they come, what is seen is a mass of people. You notice there are a lot of young people here. I frankly admire them. I really wonder if I would have the kind of courage they display to leave tyranny, to leave tremendous hardship, to leave behind everything that's familiar, to go at great risk of life and limb, shark-infested waters, hurricanes, pirates, all kinds of hardship in rickety boats that often sink, to get to a place where there's a chance for a better opportunity in life. I mean, where you're facing everything that's unfamiliar, potentially hostile, and yet there's a chance for improving the life for yourself and for your families. I really, really wish that if it comes down to it, that I would be willing to do that for myself and for my family if I had to face the same, as my ancestors actually did. Now, what is seen is often pictures in the newspapers that seem to a lot of people as, well, threatening. Oh my gosh, there's a big crowd here. How are we going to deal with this? And what is unseen is what these immigrants become. I mean, they become the giants, the heroes of art, of literature, of intellect, of science, of philosophy. The people that we have often raised up as our heroes. And one thing that Julian Simon, great economist who wrote the book, The Ultimate Resource, indicated if you look at the at the population of England, UK, and the United States over this past several hundred years, just in the last couple hundred years, you can see that the increase in the gross domestic product per person, one measure of wealth, has increased dramatically, while the population has also increased. In other words, the size of the bubble is the population, and its placement on here over time is the amount of wealth per person. Having an increased number of people didn't destroy the livelihood for the people who were there. It actually made it possible. The vast creative potential of immigrants, especially immigrants, because it's sort of a self-selective process of the best and brightest who are most courageous and diligent, willing to leave behind what is familiar and to go to the unfamiliar. I mean, they are tremendously creative. And this has been a demonstration of the fact that increasing numbers of people actually benefit us all, because increased specialization, greater division of labor, comparative advantage, all these people moving towards cities. I mean, they don't all move to get as far apart from each other as possible. Some do, this guy, but not most people. Most people like to live in the cities where the action is. Now, a couple examples of it is Hong Kong, Las Vegas, two places on the planet that have almost nothing in the way of resources. I mean, Hong Kong is a rock on the edge of the ocean, and Las Vegas is actually out in the middle of the desert. But they built fantastic cities with what Milton Friedman has said is just the one great thing, just freedom. An ability to use the talents that human beings have to create all of this, from one of the poorest countries in the world to a country where the average per capita income is higher than that of UK, greater than the country that was originally their colonial overseer. And Las Vegas, it was a desert. Nobody wanted to live there. Now, that leaves us with a whole lot of other issues.
Well, actually, one issue that I don't understand, and that's why I don't follow you, is why can't the French continue being French, or the English continue being English? I mean, if we accept all these people coming from abroad, our culture will change, our identity will change. And this is something that we should protect. I mean, if people want to associate and remain French, isn't there libertarian right to remain French without undue influences from abroad?
Good point. Now, I hope none of the rest of you get this idea that you can just burst out like this. Okay. Yes, there are some libertarians who have protested the forced integration. We shouldn't have to deal with other people of other races and other religions and various strange customs and practices. Yeah. We should be able to treat the world as if it, you anticipated what I was thinking of getting to. I mean, there are a lot of people who own property and they don't want immigrants because they want to have their own singular culture. They don't want multiculturalism. And they want to be able to exclude people. And they know that there are some other people who do want to hire immigrants or want their families to come join them, and they like the cultural diversity. But there's all this government property that they say is open for grabs. And if immigrants are allowed to come across a border and go to willy-nilly to these places, well, then that's forced integration, they say, and it should be disallowed. Well, now, there's two problems with that argument. One, from an Austrian economics point of view, and I would find it very odd if an Austrian economist made that argument, but sometimes stranger things than that happen. There is the idea that von Mises argued, for example, of the impossibility of economic calculation in a socialist society, where the government is presumed to be in a position to mimic private property, and therefore make judgments about what everybody should have based on what a private individual would do in the position of government. Well, that's an impossibility. There's no way that you can assess the price of a product, much less the value of a human being, by some government decree. A second problem with this notion that these people should be able to allow, I mean, there are a lot of times throughout history where people have used this to try and prevent immigrants from coming, for a whole variety of reasons, race and religion. And there was even no Italians wanted it one time in the United States, but that was Northern Europeans didn't want Southern Europeans to come in, and that was largely because Northern Europeans tended to be Protestant, and the Southern Europeans tended to be Catholic. So they devised all kinds of quotas, essentially to restrict people that they didn't like, that they felt they were going to be uncomfortable with. And it's also been on the basis of labor, as well as all kinds of other fears. So what they want to do is they want to say, well, all of this property really is going to be treated as if it's private property. And we'll allow some quota of people to come through to go to these people who want a few that will be allowed for employment. But all of this is to be treated as if it's ours. And the problem with that, of course, is that it denies the right of the people over here to hire who they want, to work for whom they want, to have their families join as they want. It's a violation of these people's rights by the force of these people against them. For example, they suggest the employment doesn't belong to the employer, but it applies to the native applicant for the job, or the guy who's got the job. I contend that the owner of the money, the person who's the employer paying that money to somebody else, is the one who actually owns the right to make the decision for the job. They can choose this person or this person. Well, let me just ask, think of your own country, suppose you're an employer in your native country. And you have two people that come to you looking for a job. One is a native applicant, and another one is an immigrant applicant. Okay, you don't know anything else about them except for that. And I'm asking you to make a kind of quick judgment. Which of the two do you suppose might be the harder worker? With the native applicant or the immigrant applicant? How many people say, well, the native applicant is very likely to be the harder worker of the two? Okay?
Yeah.
How many say that it will be the immigrant that will be very likely the harder worker of the two? Okay. Well, I contend regardless of what you say, the person who says that they believe that the immigrant is the harder worker, they have the right, if it's their money, their job, their business, to do so.
So what we are saying is that it's not only that we are sending jobs to China, but we should have Chinese doing jobs here. So what about, I mean, you know, exploitation and all these sort of things, low wages?
That's right.
Okay, I'll get to that point. What I wanted to argue is that the immoral act is the guy who would use the force of law to essentially imprison or fine. And very often in the United States, if you hire somebody that the government didn't give documentation to, your business can be shut down. You can be fined. You can go to jail if you don't go along with it, and so can they if they're not deported. And I would say that also this applies.
Congress, right? All those people in Congress and hiring the
choice of family members. I mean, the idea that you can't choose for yourself who your spouse is going to be, that the state has to limit you, is essentially showing a lack of confidence in your own population's judgment, or even your own culture, whatever it is. If you feel you can't face the competition of another culture, it shows a very, very lack of competition in your own. And this is the immoral act to prevent people who wish to be together, live together, have their children together, and so on. Yes. Now, for your point about jobs.
Well, but there's another point,
Okay.
which is about welfare. I mean, after all, we have a state which spends a lot of money helping people, you know, with medical bills, with pensions, things like this. But that is because we, as a nation, constituted that capital. So now people who haven't constituted that capital are coming from nowhere and saying, well, I have a right to all the wealth that you accumulated, and even if I didn't contribute to that. So, you know, is that, again, something that libertarians can condone?
That reminds me of the conference we had in the ISIL Conference in Costa Rica. We had a conference speaker on the video. Milton Friedman made that very argument. He said, well, immigration is fine, but not as long as we have the welfare state. And also more recently, Herb Rubel made this argument as well, saying that immigrants impose a burden on the taxpayers of Canada because of the welfare state. And it's probably an argument made in most countries of the world. You know, there is this feeling that, wow, they're all coming in just to get free jobs and free education, free health care, free lemonade, all sorts of things. I would say, first of all, there is a kind of welfare that drives immigration. The history of welfare of the worst kind was to tyrants, what I call tyrant welfare. The vast amounts of money that has been poured into the worst of dictatorships around the world. In fact, the United States itself has been charged with having given foreign military aid to 150 countries, 2/3 of which are on the State Department's own list of countries that abuse their own human rights within those countries. And I would say that drives immigration out of those countries because a lot of people can't stand to live under the tyranny that they face. A second form of welfare that drives migration is corporate welfare in the form of protectionism. You know, all the trade barriers that put up against, you know, sugar. You know, Americans aren't allowed to pay $1 for a bag of sugar. They have to pay $5 for the same bag of sugar that's produced domestically instead of being allowed to buy one that's produced abroad. So that makes Americans $4 poorer and also, well, enriches the local sugar company, but it impoverishes people around the world who aren't allowed to sell their sugar. And the Europeans are much worse, and the Japanese are worse than that in those kinds of things. They even have policies to destroy products of sugar in their own countries in order to keep prices high. Now, on the point of human beings, they've been treated in the same manner as sugar, by putting up quotas on the numbers that can be allowed to come in. And for the very same reasons, domestic labor never likes to compete with foreign labor. Now, it started in the United States with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Before that, there was an open immigration policy. Anybody who wanted to come, well, you're welcome. But of course, when the Chinese came, then all the fears of different races and different cultures and practices and all went up. And they started the quotas, treating human beings, and there's no accident that quotas on sugar went up about the same time as quotas on human beings. We're going to keep them out, keep the price high, so that the people domestically get more money and wealth. Now, what about the issue, does welfare within the country attract immigrants? Well, yes, there are some cases of that. But the real test of that would be, once they're in the United States, they can go to 50 different states that all have different levels of welfare. Do they all rush to the states with the most welfare? My research says it's exactly the opposite. The greatest movement, both of the domestic population and the foreign population, is away from the states that offer the most welfare to the states with the least welfare. Why? Because these are people who move because they're trying to find opportunities. Usually opportunities are the best at low welfare states. The taxes are lower there too. People don't pick up and move usually and disrupt their lives to go just to sit on welfare. I mean, if you're too lazy to work, you're going to be too lazy to move. The people who are really moving are the ones who are really courageous and industrious. The immoral act isn't done by the person on the receiving end of the welfare, in my opinion, whether they're domestic or immigrant. Maybe it's not nice or particularly noble to be on the receiving end of welfare, but the criminal action is the politician and all the people who voted for them who actually set up a system to steal from some to give to others in the first place. That's where the criminal action is. I found one interesting observation when I was traveling around this summer. We were at St. Thomas Square in Athens during the big protests, you know, and all the people out there in the streets, give us more money, don't cut us out, we want more welfare. But all around the square were those hawkers, the immigrants, who were selling eyeglasses, sunglasses, and bananas, and corn on the cob, and all kinds of things, that, and lighters, toys of all sorts of things, trying to eke out a living from these people who wanted to steal their living through the politicians.
And also things used to protest, like whistles.
Oh yeah! Those little green lights to shine. The protesters are saying profit is theft, but the people around them, who were the most hard-pressed from Bangladesh to Senegal, were eager to find a way, entrepreneurial as they were, to make a living for themselves. So, now,
Hang on. All these people who come from abroad make a statement. I don't respect the law. I come here as an illegal immigrant. And isn't there something that justifies what we fear, is that these illegal immigrants, being in a culture of illegality, become the most criminal offenders when they settle in a new country. Criminality is mostly done by immigrants.
Terrorism, it's the war on terror that's been used as justification for most of the increased barriers and restrictions on life and all of the points in the UK or whatever. Well, let me give you an example to illustrate the point. There was one terrorist in the United States, homegrown, born in New York, and from New York. He went over to Oklahoma and set off a bomb that blew up a federal building. Now, per capita, this guy killed more people by himself than all those 15 terrorists who destroyed the World Trade Center did on an individual basis. I mean, there were a lot of deaths responsible that this person was responsible for. Timothy McVeigh, you know, a terrible criminal, really did a terrible crime. Would it have made sense to put up a wall around New York City, around New York, and say that all the people of New York shouldn't be allowed to travel to any of the other states because we think collectivism is a very, very, very primitive tool for any kind of desired end. As Ayn Rand put it, racism is the most primitive form of collectivism. It tends to brush everyone of a particular racial or ethnic or religious or any kind of group, regardless of their own individual behavior. Any kind of justice has to be achieved by holding people individually accountable for their own actions. And you can do that rather than to hold a whole innocent population guilty for the actions of others. And you can do that more effectively if you have effective law enforcement and defense measures to go against the genuine criminals, but not treating everyone as if they're criminals. Because if they're all treated as criminals, you don't have any time to find these guys. You're so busy controlling these people. Now, throughout history, people have put up deadly walls. My wife, who came from China, said that the Great Wall of China was probably the world's biggest graveyard and the biggest disaster. It was totally ineffective, and there were probably 100,000 Chinese laborers that were buried in the wall as they were trying to build it. But there were other walls that have been very, very deadly. The wall on between East and West Germany, you know, the Berlin Wall. But the whole Iron Curtain was a disaster. I mean, it was basically trying to keep people in. And people cheered and were so happy when the wall came down, because now no longer could you keep people in. But you know, there are other kinds of walls too that have killed the innocent. There was the case of Anne Frank. And she's just symbolic of the millions of people in Europe that died during and prior to World War II, who, in this case, Anne Frank's father twice applied for visas to come to the United States. 30 countries around the Atlantic had agreed to a quota system that wouldn't allow the Jews to escape, and the American officials said there's no allowable permission, the quota is full. Well, frankly, I think they would have been right to break the law. I think it was okay for them to break the law. The law said they shouldn't migrate, they should stay there and die. I say no. You don't have to stay there and die. It isn't your right to oblige to obey the law that violates individual rights. The purpose of law is to protect individual rights. When the law itself violates individual rights, it's nullified, in my view. So these people had a right to escape, as I believe, when the law said that slaves should not run away from their masters in the 1800s, I believe they had a right to escape. And it was the law that was unjust and wrong to hold them in place. So regardless of which side of the wall the guard is on, if it prevents someone to escape from tyranny, famine, extraordinary hardship, then either side of the wall, it's the same effect. And collaboration, putting up a wall and preventing people from escaping from tyrants, is collaboration with tyranny. And I would say the immoral act is of the person who puts up that wall and prevents people from finding a better life. The most recent example of this is across the deserts of Arizona, where the government is spending billions of dollars to build a wall that, for the most part, is going to be ineffective. Penn and Teller did a nice demonstration of this. They hired 9 illegal immigrants to build a wall to spec, you know, to the same kind of categorization as the government was going to do it. And after they built it, they gave them a chance, a prize. See, they broke them into 3 groups. One would go over, one would go through, and one would go under the wall. And they say, well, the prize goes to the group of 3 that can get to the other side quickest. And all 3 groups got to the other side in under 3 minutes. The government's going to spend $4 billion on that section of the wall alone. You know, there's another guy, Matt Staton, in Arizona. I was there one day. The announcement came in the newspaper. The judge had convicted him and his group, No More Deaths, for placing water bottles at pathways across the desert, where hundreds of people die every year. As a matter of fact, since 9/11, more people have died on the deserts just trying to find a better life than died at the World Trade Center in 9/11. I mean, it's a lot of deaths. And this guy was convicted of littering.
What was his sentence?
His sentence, they waived the jail time. They said you have to do 60 hours of community service. Well, his supporters said he already did that. So,
Well, fine. But if you don't have this wall, you have millions of people. I mean, imagine in a country like Switzerland, or even a country like the UK, if you don't prevent people from coming, you say, no, open borders, no walls, come once, then you will have flotillas of these boat people and so on, landing on our shores and occupying the country like an army, like an occupation army. Thousands and tens of thousands and millions.
may I ask another question?
Sorry, I
agree.
think
This is a very, very good point, and it is in there because people have this great anxiety and fear. Well, what happens? You see the crowds coming in. And of course, it's people like noble people in the United States said, yes, you should take them all in, but don't send them over here. You know, there's a lot of people in Korea who are desperate to flee North Korea. The United States won't take them, so Chinese government sends them back too. Well, yes, this is certainly a problem, and it's an initial problem where you've got these massive crowds of humanity trying to find its place out. But I would contend that, well, it's our task not to justify sending them back or justify confining them into these small things, but our task to open up the world so that there are a lot of other places to go. For example, everywhere you go, coming here, I flew over for hours. I can fly over the United States, and I look down, and there aren't cities, there's forests, and there's some deserts, and there's fields and farmlands. I mean, there's lots and lots of space out there. I fly over Europe, and I find much the same thing, because it turns out that most of the people live in cities, and that covers a very, very small actual land area. They could accept these people easily if they didn't. I really praise the people in Malta and for Italy for having undergone this tremendous human wave, but it should be shared certainly by every other country in the world. People fleeing tyranny. Now, even in Hawaii, if you look at space, I mean, the Hawaiian Islands aren't great. You look at them, you look at a big map and so on, you probably even can't find the dots on there. Yeah. But when you calculate, let's say, land area, you could hold all the refugees of the world today, which is estimated around 30 million refugees, both internal, within countries, and external. You could hold them all on the Hawaiian Islands. And you'd still have only 1/3 of the population density of Hong Kong. And that includes 40% Country Park, where nobody's allowed to live. So, I mean, it's true, you don't necessarily want to change it overnight, and it takes time to adjust to these things. But it's not an impossibility. Human beings are extraordinarily valuable. They're certainly more valuable than oil. And they aren't just a drain on your resources. if given the time and the opportunity, the freedom and chance to make life for themselves, they can create a much better world when there's freedom. But they will die if they don't. So all I ask is that we treat other people as we would want them to treat us if we were in their shoes. So, thank you. Three points. First, about the context. Right now, we do have a world that's not libertarian. We have welfare benefits. And it's argued that, well, if people came, regardless of whose fault it is, we have to take account of the fact that people would be getting, may qualify for welfare, and so therefore it would be a drain on the system. We have to be careful not to allow the first aggression by government, meaning that they're going to take money from one person to give to another in terms of welfare, to justify putting off other freedoms. Because we could say, well, no one should be allowed to have children until we end the welfare system. Because, well, they're just going to be born into a system that they'll be eligible for welfare, hospital stays, and school. So, well, we should prohibit that. And countries do. They say one child per family. We might say, well, no new school. Because after all, they might be recipients of government subsidies, which currently exist. So we can't allow ourselves into the trap of saying the current oppressions by government can't serve as a justification for further oppressions or restrictions on our freedom. If it breaks the welfare system, so much the better, so much the sooner. It's not the fault of the immigrant. It's the fault of the people who voted for the politicians and the politicians themselves. Now, it's about the boat landing on the beach. Actually, that's how the Europeans came to the Americans, and they were considered illegal immigrants by the Indians, right? And it's true that the beach in a libertarian world would be privately owned. I would say government property should be just open for homesteading. If it's government property, then whoever can have it first. Maybe that's an immigrant. And an immigrant isn't a dirty word because it's people moving around the planet. And we've demonstrated through Valerie's survey, well, everybody moves around the planet who is wealthy enough and in a position enough to be allowed to do so. But I say that if I was an employer and was allowed, and as the early railroads in the United States, they made these huge contracts, plantations made huge contracts, first in Japan. They brought thousands of workers over to work the plantations, either in Hawaii or the railroads in California. The Chinese, then the Portuguese, then the Filipinos. And then the protectionists made all of that illegal, so that the employer can't go abroad and set up all these contracts and bring them over as labor. Well, that's the outlawing such contracts. They should allow you the freedom to go find your employment, and for them, the employer, to go all over the world seeking employment.